Welcome back. Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, he met with the media yesterday. We showed you some of the highlights where he tried to defend his actions more than a decade ago, when, as the U.S. Attorney for Florida, Acosta, he approved an incredibly light sentence on Jeffrey Epstein, who had just been arrested once again, for sexually abusing and prostituting underage girls. Essentially, the very same crimes that Epstein was arrested for and charged with in Florida a decade ago. Now, as you do know, Epstein, he got a slap on the wrist in that 2008 case. No prosecution, immunity from federal charges, and a guilty plea to 2 state charges of soliciting a minor for prostitution. Epstein, he got 13 months in jail. He was allowed to leave jail 6 days a week to go to work and theoretically make millions. The self-proclaimed billionaire, he also had to pay restitution, but please. So the man who signed off on that deal, Alex Acosta. In 2008, he was the U.S. Attorney for Southern Florida. Well, today, he's the Trump Labor Secretary, and yesterday, as mentioned, he tried to save his job and image as Acosta tried to make himself a hero for making that deal in question.
The Palm Beach State Attorney's Office was ready to let Epstein walk free. No jail time, nothing. Our prosecutors, as this 2008 article recounts, presented the ultimatum: plead guilty to more serious charges that required jail time, registration, and restitution, or we'd roll the dice and bring a federal indictment. Without the work of our prosecutors, Epstein would have gotten away with just that state charge.
But it should be noted, some key people in the know say Acosta, he got it all wrong with his rationale yesterday. The prosecutor in the state case against Epstein, he called Acosta's account of what happened completely wrong. Those his words. He also added that Acosta should not be allowed to rewrite history. Then there's the response from Julie K. Brown. She's the journalist who has kept digging in this story of Epstein, and she won a Polk Award, among others, for her efforts with the Miami Herald. She's also widely credited, even by federal prosecutors, for doing the legwork that led to Epstein's second arrest this week. Brown says Acosta's claims, quote, sound true if you don't read the court record. She says Acosta was wrong in the lack of witness and evidence that 36 different underage girls were all telling the exact same story. Brown asked why, if the deal Acosta cut with Epstein was so good, why were his victims not notified of the deal, and why did Acosta refuse to take that or return their phone calls on the very case? Brown also says that in a meeting with Epstein's attorneys that Acosta says came after the deal was done, Brown says Acosta was not accurate in that claim and that aspects of the deal were still being worked out at the moment. Former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi joins us, and he is not happy with Acosta's answers either. One of the things, Gene, and I spoke to a former federal prosecutor yesterday, they said if you listen to Acosta's account of events, it's like he worked for the district attorney in the case instead of him being the Fed. And secondly, the idea of claiming that he was the guy on the white knight that saved this, it just begs credulity. That it's bizarre. Now, from your end, you heard, obviously, you've seen the facts of the case. Then you see what happened in New York. You heard from the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. And you've also heard from some of the principals who said that's not what happened. What's your take?
My take is this non-prosecution agreement, and I've just read it last few days, is corrupt to the core. It is unprecedented, and it is an embarrassment. And those are its good qualities. I think of this phrase, the tail doesn't wag the dog. With the utmost respect to state prosecutors, and there are some phenomenal state prosecutors that I worked with in my almost 30 years. They were phenomenal. If I had a federal case, if I had a 53-page indictment alleging the conduct that Epstein is allegedly doing or has done, I would not let the state prosecution wag the dog. I was the big dog. The U.S. Attorney's Office is the big dog. That is just reality. And Acosta was shameful because he was trying to shift the blame to the state prosecutor. And what that state prosecutor basically said in his statement is that Alex Acosta was lying big time. And here's the problem with this non-prosecution agreement and why I consider it disgraceful. It gives Epstein complete transactional immunity. And what did the government get in exchange for that? Zippo. We didn't get cooperation. We didn't get any information from Epstein about his other conspirators. We got nothing. But here's the problem for Jeffrey Epstein. He is not protected from the Southern District of New York's indictment because this non-prosecution agreement only binds the Southern District of Florida. It does not bind the Southern District of New York. Problem number one. Problem number two is the conspiracy that the Southern District of New York has charged is much broader than that tiny little bit of evidence that Acosta had Jeffrey Epstein plead guilty to or agree to his conduct. So that doesn't help Jeffrey Epstein at all.
Now, Gene, you mentioned the Southern District, then I want to get back to what happened in Florida and how it was handled. But not only when you heard Berman talk here, who's obviously the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District, how forceful he was, but you've got the corruption unit that's working on this as well. Do you get any kind of tell from that we may not just be talking about Epstein and finally seeing real justice for what he did, but there could be other players involved?
Absolutely. And with the utmost respect to the U.S. Attorney Berman, when he said pay no attention to the assignment to the Public Corruption Unit, I just smiled. It was not a slow day in the Public Corruption Unit, and they just handed them the Jeffrey Epstein file. There were probably a series of meetings to determine which unit in the Southern District of New York, and I got to compliment them, which unit was going to get this case. And here's the problem for Jeffrey Epstein and all the potential conspirators and individuals who may have been involved in this racketeering, RICO, I call it, trafficking. This investigation is now focusing on, in my humble view, on current and past elected and appointed and career public servants. I want to go back to the former governor of New York, John Doe number 9. He wasn't really on the radar screen at the beginning, but then when they started investigating, he obviously got on the radar screen. There are going to be individuals who are very nervous right now at the highest level of our democracy. Do I need to say more? Who are very nervous about what the Southern District of New York is doing. And I got to say this, if Bill Barr puts his unethical finger on the scale in the Southern District of New York, there will be holy HE double hockey sticks.
Well, I was going to say, because when he made a point, I'm talking about the Attorney General Barr, that he was recusing himself from the Florida matter, but not the New York matter. It certainly made a lot of ears perk up. But I just don't see the Southern District quietly going into the good night here to go along, to get along, just because Barr doesn't want to. Now, I want to ask a couple questions, because if you just listened to Acosta and you didn't know the facts of the case, you would swear that New York, this is a brand new case that they're opening. But isn't it very possible, Gene, some of the very same evidence that they're now using against Epstein was there for Acosta a decade ago that he chose not to use or not to string together with this fakakta argument that it would have been a roll of the dice? It certainly seemed, if he wanted to use the FBI more thoroughly and he really wanted to go after it with a lot of corroborating witnesses, he had more than a roll of a dice, to quote him, chance to get a real conviction back then. Maybe not all this evidence is new.
Richard, you brought up a good point. The argument that the defense attorneys are going to make, and Jeffrey Epstein's got great attorneys, they are going to say that the Southern District of New York is another bite at the apple. It's a do-over. Here's the problem with that argument. If you read this NPA, non-prosecution agreement, it's very narrow compared to the number of victims, where the alleged act occurred. And the Southern District of New York indictment that just came out That's very expansive, number one. Many more victims, over 80. And number two, you have a lot of acts in New York. And that's a different conspiracy than the one that they were looking at in Miami. Much different. I had this same issue once. I had a drug dealer who killed about 35 people. He got a very good deal down in Miami, federal U.S. Attorney's Office, because they didn't have enough evidence against him, but he pleaded guilty to a charge there. And then we charged him up in Eastern District of Virginia on an expansive conspiracy. The Fourth Circuit, U.S. Court of Appeals, had no problem. There was no double jeopardy. There was no re-prosecution issue.
You mentioned some of this, Gene, but when you look at the immunity deal he got, the NDA that Epstein got in Florida, and that Acosta didn't even have the decency to let these young victims know where it went, and they literally had to hire attorneys to follow it along. And for him to turn around and said he did that for the kids, I mean, I don't know. It was not just I thought I was getting snowed, but it was distasteful, I thought, yesterday. And forget that there was no even apology or I wish I did this or that different. If you listen to him, you'd swear he deserved the medal for his actions.
Well, if you just turn the television sound off and you just looked at him, he had those American flags perfectly aligned. He had the right composure. When he began his press conference, he had that long pause that you learn in the public speaking classes. But when it came to the substance of what he said, he was a complete failure. And one of the major reasons is the victim issue. Let me tell you this. When I was a prosecutor, I felt that my role was being a voice for those who could not speak for themselves, those who are alive and those who have passed and died, the afraid, the frightened, the vulnerable. You are their voice. Acosta failed in his mission to be a voice for those victims. And that's the thing that breaks my heart the most, is the way those victims were treated. And his rationale for not notifying the victims, I got to tell you, it made no sense. It was like catch-22. There was no logic to it. George Orwell, 1984, there was no reason to it. He should have informed the victims. He did not. Shame on him.
And as we heard from the Southern District, they are not playing around here. Hey, Gene, I appreciate your time as always. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, since we're talking about the law, on the other side of the break, we're going to be talking about a court case going on in New Orleans. And literally the fate of it could be the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. The implications of this case could be huge. And if you read the tea leaves, the judges think this thing might get tossed. We'll have all that and much more after this.